It's fascism, and we'll be using Robert Paxton's book, The Anatomy of Fascism, as our guide. So think of this as like a crash course on understanding what fascism is, where it came from, and why it still matters even today.
And it's interesting because that term fascism gets thrown around so much these days, and sometimes it loses its real meaning. But to really grasp the dangers of it, we need to understand its historical context and the mechanics of how it actually operates.
Right. It's like we're dissecting this dangerous idea under a microscope to figure out how it works, how to protect ourselves from it. Now, even defining fascism is not exactly straightforward. It's not like there's a simple checklist.
Exactly. Fascist movements are kind of like different species of plants. They may look different on the surface, but they share these fundamental biological processes. That's how Paxton approaches it. He analyzes these fascist movements in 5 stages.
Okay, 5 stages.
Creation, taking root, seizing power, exercising power, and then the long-term trajectory.
Okay, so 5 stages. If we think about the Nazis, for example, which stage do you think was absolutely crucial to their success?
That's a great question. Looking at the Nazis through Paxton's framework, I would argue that the taking root stage was absolutely pivotal. This is where they transitioned from a fringe group to a genuine political force. They were able to tap into all the anxieties and resentments of post-World War I Germany, hyperinflation, unemployment, national humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles, and they offered these scapegoats and promises of national revival.
That makes sense. They were offering solutions, however twisted, to these real problems that people were facing.
Right.
And it's interesting because this whole idea that fascism is anti-capitalist is a bit of a misconception, right?
Absolutely. While fascist rhetoric often rails against international finance capitalism, the reality is much more nuanced. For instance, fascist regimes, including the Nazis, protected national producers, and they were obsessed with full employment and productivity. Their goal was a strong national economy, even if it meant suppressing workers' rights.
So it was less about rejecting capitalism entirely and more about kind of bending it to their own nationalistic goals.
Exactly.
To really understand how this ideology emerged, we need to rewind even further. Back to the late 19th century, what was going on in Europe that laid the groundwork for these fascist ideas to even take hold.
Okay, so think about Europe in the late 1800s. It's a time of massive social and economic change. You have industrialization, urbanization, mass immigration, all happening at this really rapid pace. Imagine yourself living through that time, all the anxieties, all the uncertainty, and that's what some intellectuals and cultural figures began to tap into.
So it's like this countercurrent to the prevailing liberal tides of the time.
Exactly.
A pushback against all these rapid changes that were happening all around them.
And some pretty dangerous ideas were already brewing. They championed aggressive nationalism, they romanticized violence as this purifying force, and they promoted racial theories. It's like the seeds of fascism were being sown even before the word itself existed.
It's fascinating and a bit unsettling to see how these seemingly fringe ideas kind of took root in mainstream thought. Paxton calls this early stage National Socialism. Were there any figures who really embodied these early forms of this dangerous ideology?
There were a few key figures who foreshadowed later fascist developments. One striking example is Maurice Barrès. He was a French nationalist writer who actually coined the term National Socialism, and he saw the nation as this living organism that needed to be protected from these corrupting influences.
And did this tie into anti-Semitism, which became such a central part of fascist ideology later on?
Unfortunately, yes. Barrès, along with figures like the Marquis de Morez, a flamboyant French aristocrat. They combined their nationalist rhetoric with attacks on Jews, who they saw as a threat to national unity. Morez even organized these gangs of anti-Semitic thugs. And get this, they wore cowboy outfits.
Cowboy hats and anti-Semitism, that's a disturbing combination.
It certainly is. But what's important is that these figures represent this growing rejection of liberal values, and this turn toward a more aggressive, exclusionary form of nationalism. And this was all happening against the backdrop of the rise of mass politics. More and more people were getting the right to vote, which meant that new social groups were entering the political arena. Shopkeepers, professionals, workers, they had anxieties and frustrations that populist movements could exploit.
So you have this perfect storm brewing, rising anxieties, this shift in political dynamics, and these seeds of dangerous ideologies taking root. And then World War I explodes onto the scene.
World War I was a turning point, no question. It shattered Europe's pre-war order and profoundly impacted the rise of fascism. The sheer scale of death and destruction was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. And you have to think about the impact this had on people. especially veterans who had witnessed those horrors firsthand.
It's almost unimaginable, that level of trauma. It created this vacuum of ideology, right? The old certainties were gone, and people were desperate for answers.
Exactly. And in the aftermath of the war, you had all these competing visions for the future. You had liberal internationalists who wanted to prevent another war through diplomacy. Then you had conservatives who wanted to restore traditional authority and order. And of course, there was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which presented this radical alternative of communist revolution.
So many different ideas swirling around, each one trying to make sense of all the chaos. Where did fascism fit into this whirlwind of competing visions?
Fascism offered a distinct path. It rejected both the old ways and the radicalism of the left, appealing to those who were disillusioned with traditional authority, but terrified of communist revolution. They were particularly effective at targeting veterans who felt betrayed by the peace and were looking for a new outlet for their wartime experiences.
It's like they exploited this sweet spot of discontent, promising a return to strength and glory. So we have the cultural shifts, the rise of mass politics, the trauma of World War I, and this fertile ground for radical ideologies to flourish. But how did these fascist movements actually gain traction? How did they go from the fringes to becoming genuine contenders for power?
Well, to understand that, we need to look at some specific examples. Paxton dives into early fascist movements in Hungary, Italy, and of course Germany. And what we see is this pattern of exploiting anxieties, using violence and forming unlikely alliances.
Alliances, you say? That's interesting. Let's unpack that a bit. Okay, so we left off talking about alliances, and it seems counterintuitive that these establishment figures, the ones already in power, would actually help fascists gain influence. Why would they do that?
It might seem strange, but it often boiled down to fear.
Yeah.
Think about it. Conservatives, business elites, even some liberals. They were all terrified of communist revolution. They saw what happened in Russia, and they thought, could that happen here? So they made this calculated and ultimately disastrous gamble.
They thought better a far-right dictator than a communist revolution. It's a chilling reminder of how short-sightedness and self-interest can pave the way for tyranny.
It really is. And to see how these alliances played out in practice, let's dive into how fascists actually seized power. Let's start with Italy. How did Mussolini and his black shirts go from street thugs to running the entire country?
Yeah, it's a story that often gets romanticized, the whole March on Rome spectacle. What really happened?
Well, by the early 1920s, the Fascist Party had a grip on certain parts of Italy, especially in rural areas where they'd violently crushed socialist groups. They weren't just a bunch of street thugs anymore. They were a force to be reckoned with. And that's where the alliances come in. Prime Minister Giolitti, this veteran politician, saw the fascists as a tool to use against the growing Socialist Party. He foolishly decided to include them in his coalition for the 1921 elections.
He basically legitimized them by bringing them into mainstream politics. I bet that backfired spectacularly.
Oh, it did. The fascists won 35 seats in parliament. This gave them a national platform and this veneer of respectability that they never had before. And Giolitti, who thought he could control them, realized that he'd unleashed a force that he couldn't contain.
A classic case of underestimating your enemy. So what happened next? Did they immediately grab power after getting into parliament?
It wasn't quite that swift. But they certainly didn't waste any time. The fascists kept using violence and intimidation. They disrupted meetings, they attacked trade unions, and they created this climate of fear. And at the same time, they played on people's desire for order, for a strong leader who could fix things.
That's such a common tactic. So chaos, and then present yourself as the solution. So how did we get to this infamous March on Rome?
That was Mussolini's masterstroke. It was this brilliant piece of political theater. In 1922, he orchestrated this march on the Capitol with thousands of his black shirts. It was a show of force, a threat to take over the government by force.
So was it actually a violent coup? Did they fight their way in?
Not exactly. It was more bluster than bloodshed. King Victor Emmanuel III, facing this mob of black shirts, decided to fold.
Just surrendered. Why?
Well, there are debates about his motives, but fear definitely played a role. He was terrified of civil war. Plus, he saw Mussolini as the lesser evil compared to the socialists. It was a fear-driven decision that led to decades of fascist rule.
It's a chilling reminder of how fragile democracies can be. One moment of weakness, one miscalculation, and everything can change.
Exactly. And, the rise of the Nazis in Germany, while obviously horrific, followed a different path. They were much more strategic in their use of the very democratic system they aimed to destroy.
Okay, so let's talk about that. The Nazi Party starts as this small fringe group, and within a few years, they're in control of one of the most powerful nations in Europe. How did that happen?
Well, the Great Depression played a huge role.
Yeah.
By the early 1930s, Germany was in economic freefall, millions unemployed, Widespread poverty. Imagine the despair, the anger, the feeling that the system had failed. This was the Nazis' moment.
So they offered a scapegoat, a target for all that anger and frustration.
Right. They hammered home this message that the Weimar Republic, Germany's fledgling democracy, was weak and incompetent. They blamed the Jews, the communists, anyone who didn't fit their twisted vision of a pure Germany. And they promised solutions: jobs, stability, a return to national pride.
The same playbook as Mussolini: exploit the chaos, offer simple solutions, and scapegoat anyone who gets in the way.
Exactly. But unlike Mussolini's grab for power, the Nazis were incredibly savvy about exploiting the democratic system itself.
That seems counterintuitive. Didn't they despise democracy?
They did. But they were clever. They
Yeah.
participated in elections, and as the economic crisis worsened, their vote share grew. They also used their seats in parliament to obstruct the government, making the Weimar Republic scene even more dysfunctional.
It's like they were playing this long game, using the system to undermine itself from within.
Precisely. And of course, they never abandoned violence. The SA, their paramilitary wing, terrorized opponents and created this climate of fear. Is this carefully calibrated strategy, political maneuvering combined with brute force.
So they had the votes, they had the muscle, and they had a society primed for their message. But what was the final push? How did they actually go from a powerful party to the rulers of Germany?
The turning point came in 1933. President Hindenburg, this aging conservative figure, appointed Hitler as chancellor.
Wait, so the Nazis were appointed, not elected, to lead the country?
That's right. Hindenburg and his advisors thought they could control Hitler, use his popularity to their advantage while keeping him in check. It's this classic case of the establishment underestimating the extremist threat.
It's like Giolitti's blunder in Italy all over again.
Exactly. And it was a fatal miscalculation. Within months, Hitler used the Reichstag fire, a fire at the Parliament building, as this pretext to consolidate power. He suspended civil liberties, outlawed other parties, and established a one-party dictatorship.
So a combination of political maneuvering, calculated violence, and a manufactured crisis allowed Hitler to seize control of Germany. It's a stark warning about how democracies can crumble, not just through violent revolution, but through this slow, insidious erosion of rights and freedom.
It's a lesson we can't afford to forget. And now that we've seen how these fascist movements seized power, let's shift gears and look at what that power looked like in practice. How did these regimes transform their societies? How did they govern?
That's what I'm really curious about. What did it actually mean to live under fascist rule? So we've seen how these fascist movements seized power. But what was it actually like to live under their rule? How did they transform society according to their ideology?
Well, Paxton argues that fascist regimes are constantly balancing these two opposing forces, normalization and radicalization. It's a kind of push and pull that shapes how they govern.
Normalization and radicalization, those seem like contradictory impulses. How do those coexist within a regime?
Think about it. On one hand, any government needs to establish order and stability to function. It needs institutions, it needs to eliminate its rivals, and it needs at least some level of popular support.
So that's the normalization part, making fascist rule seem like the new normal, the way things are supposed to be.
Right. But on the other hand, fascist ideology is inherently radical. It's all about transforming society, rejecting existing norms and values, and creating this utopian vision, often rooted in racial purity and national dominance.
So you have this built-in tension, the need to actually run a country, versus this drive to revolutionize everything.
Exactly. And how this tension plays out varies depending on the specific regime. Take Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, for example. Two fascist regimes, but very different approaches.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's start with Italy. How did Mussolini balance these competing forces?
Once in power, Mussolini showed this surprising tendency towards normalization. He wanted to be seen as this legitimate leader, accepted by the establishment, not just a revolutionary firebrand. He kept the monarchy in place. He made peace with the Catholic Church, and even incorporated many existing institutions rather than destroying them outright.
So he was playing the role of a traditional dictator, at least to some extent.
In a way, yes. He ruled through this mix of repression and co-optation. He silenced his opponents, he controlled the press, and established a one-party state. But he also wanted to project this image of order and stability. Think about it. You're an average Italian living in the 1920s. Your life has been chaotic for years, economic hardship, political instability. Suddenly, there's a strong leader promising to restore order. You might be tempted to go along with it.
It's easy to see how that message would appeal to people who are tired of chaos and uncertainty. But surely the more radical aspects of fascist ideology didn't just disappear.
You're right. The violence didn't stop completely. Mussolini's regime still used intimidation and created mass organizations to indoctrinate people. They promoted a cult of personality around Il Duce and pursued an aggressive foreign policy, like the invasion of Ethiopia.
So normalization on the surface, but radicalization simmering underneath. It sounds like a recipe for instability.
It was. And that tension eventually contributed to Mussolini's downfall. The compromises he made alienated his more radical followers, while his foreign policy blunders led to disaster in World War II.
So a cautionary tale about the limits of trying to tame a fundamentally radical ideology. Now let's shift gears to Nazi Germany. How did Hitler's regime handle this push and pull between normalization and radicalization?
Hitler's path was far more radical, right from the start. He had this clear, ruthless vision for transforming Germany, according to Nazi ideologists.
So less pragmatism, more fanaticism.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
The Nazis immediately dismantled the Weimar Republic and established a totalitarian state. Think about what that means for people living in Germany at the time. Everything changes overnight. They purged their opponents, created this vast network of concentration camps, and launched this systematic campaign of terror.
It's hard to imagine the normalization aspect being present at all in that context.
You're right. The Nazis were far more radical in their approach. But even they sought a degree of stability. They built support through propaganda and mass rallies, eliminated rivals within the party, and created this complex bureaucracy to manage the state.
So even the most radical regime needs some level of order to function. But in Nazi Germany, that radical impulse always dominated.
Absolutely. Hitler was driven by this unshakable belief in the superiority of the Aryan race and the need to purify Germany. And that led to the most horrific consequences imaginable, the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of millions of Jews.
It's a horrifying reminder of the dangers of faith, allowing extremist ideologies to gain power, and how quickly things can spiral out of control. So we've seen these two contrasting approaches in Italy and Germany. But beyond those specific cases, what broader lessons can we learn from Paxton's analysis of how these fascist regimes operate?
One key takeaway is that these regimes are inherently unstable. They're constantly trying to balance pragmatism with ideology, order with revolution. And that tension often leads to internal conflicts, policy shifts, and even as we saw with Mussolini collapse.
It's like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. And that unpredictability makes these regimes incredibly dangerous. They can change course, escalate violence, or launch reckless wars at any moment.
Exactly. That's why understanding this instability is crucial. It means we can't just appease or accommodate them. We need to be vigilant about defending democratic institutions, holding leaders accountable, and challenging extremist ideologies wherever they emerge.
This has been a sobering but vital conversation. But before we wrap up, we need to talk about the legacy of fascism. Is it truly a thing of the past, or can it reappear in new forms?
It's a question that haunts us all. Paxton argues that while the classical fascism of the 1920s and 30s is gone, the conditions that gave rise to it, social anxieties, economic crises, political polarization, they haven't disappeared.
So the potential for fascism, or something resembling it, is always there lurking beneath the surface.
It's a sobering thought, but yes, we need to be on guard against these new forms of extremism that exploit those same anxieties and grievances. They might not wear the same symbols or use the same language, but the underlying patterns will be the same.
So it's not just about looking for swastikas or black shirts. It's about recognizing the deeper signs, the scapegoating, the demonization of opponents, the erosion of democratic norms, the allure of these simple solutions to complex problems.
That's it, exactly. It's about understanding the anatomy of fascism so we can recognize it and resist it, no matter what form it takes.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about. It's been a fascinating and frankly terrifying look at one of history's most dangerous ideologies.
I agree. And as you reflect on all we've discussed, think about this. Could fascism reappear? Not in some easily recognizable form, but by exploiting anxieties in a completely different way. And how can we, as individuals and as a society, stay vigilant against that threat?
Those are questions we all need to grapple with. Understanding the past is not just an academic exercise. It's vital for safeguarding our future. So stay informed, stay engaged, and stay vigilant. Until next time, keep diving deep.